There, it's an anniversary today, a big one. It's been 1 year since Russian planes first started hitting targets in Syria. Since then, Moscow's anti-terrorist air campaigns had considerable success in turning the tide in the war there.
The US policy in Syria is in tatters.
Syria is a mess. It's not going to be solved easily, even by Putin.
Вы хоть понимаете теперь, чего вы натворили?
Russian jets hit over 200 terror targets in eastern and northern Syria just over the weekend.
Some members of the international community continue to accuse Moscow of attacking the Syrian opposition forces and civilians.
Russia continues to support the Syrian president, regardless of the criticism.
US-Russian talks produced results. Переговоры нужно срочно возобновлять, продолжая работу со всеми без исключения сирийскими сторонами.
The offensive began then on September the 30th, 2015, after an official request by the Syrian government. Since then, around 30,000 targets have been hit by the Russian military, killing almost 5,000 terrorists. Thousands of missions have been carried out, many of which helped to bring some 1,500 tons of humanitarian aid to civilians in that war-torn country. Murad Gazdiev takes a look at Russia's 12 months in Syria.
It isn't by accident that we're in Palmyra. The Russian military considers it the crowning jewel of their operation here in Syria. It's on this stage, just behind me, that ISIS staged one of its worst massacres. It forced children to execute prisoners of war, captured Syrian troops. It forced the locals of Palmyra to watch the entire sick spectacle, after which the undesirables among them were executed. ISIS bombed, detonated the various ruins here, 2,000-year-old temples and columns and buildings dating back to the times of the Romans. And they were only stopped when the Syrian military, backed by the Russian Air Force, forced them out.
When ISIL militants seized the city, they took the government workers, beheaded them, and left their corpses on the streets. Then they started to destroy the antiquities.
Russian engineers have done a great job with mine clearance. If it wasn't for them, the whole city and all of its residents would have been turned to ash.
1 year ago, jihadists were dominant on almost every front, but that's changed. Over the last year, they've been beaten back in Latakia, forced out of their strongholds around the capital, beaten back in Aleppo, and the fighting is brutal. I've been to many of the places where this war is raging, and it isn't pretty. Civilians are dying, there's no denying it. However, the blame game is in full swing. The United States maintains that it's Russia that is causing the majority of civilian casualties, and the media has jumped onto that bandwagon.
At least 200 civilians have been killed in Russian airstrikes in Syria.
Indiscriminately bombing a civilian area.
Russian jets are responsible for the strikes.
Dozens of civilian casualties.
Killed countless civilians.
The United States made clear from the onset that they didn't want the Russians here. They didn't want this operation. The difference is the Russians were invited to Syria by the Syrian government. The United States-led coalition invited itself in. The United States has made clear who their favorite side in this civil war are.
ناولوني لأمضي في طريق الكفاية بحمد الجماع ناولوني فإن عن عريق الأسبوع للعدو يدور Allahu Akbar.
More than a year on, let's get one opinion on it. Joining us now live is Paul Moorcroft, the director of the UK-based Centre for Foreign Policy Analysis. Hi, Paul. Thanks for being with us today. So, yes, big anniversary on the calendar today, but how do you view Russia's influence on the war in Syria so far? Has it been a positive thing?
Initially, I thought it was good. It made a difference. It had been a stalemate for years, and Russian power had reduced the threat from the Islamic State, although most of the Russian targets were against the Free Syrian Forces, not the Islamic State. So it did change things. And it looked like it was working because it meant the Americans had to deal with the Russians as equals, which is what President Putin wanted. They were talking together about joint targeting, so at least deconflicting so that aircraft didn't hit each other. So until recently, I think it was a bonus for the Russians because they tested their weapons, they maintained their position in terms of the air base and the sea base. They got back into their Middle East position, and they made sure that Assad was not defeated. But President Putin has overplayed his hand now, because in the West and in parts...
Overplayed his hand a year on. A year ago, let's not forget, America had been in there and appeared to have done very little. ISIS seemed to be spreading. There were attacks that were getting closer and closer to Damascus. That's not the case now.
No, let me explain. I was just trying to explain what I meant by overplayed his hand, because the Russians, President Putin had achieved what he wanted to in terms of status, in terms of keeping Assad in, because it's accepted in the West that Assad has a part to play in the transition. So everything Russia wanted until a few weeks ago. But suddenly, Russia, because of the attacks on Aleppo, the bombing that's going on there, it's not propaganda in the West. There's major attacks on that because the Damascus government wants to get Aleppo back. But that involved a massive amount of civilian slaughter. So the Russians, from being people who stepped in and helped, are now seen in the West, and perhaps at home in Russia, increasingly as baby killers, because the Russians are considered now, and they've destroyed the relationship with America. That's what I mean by overplaying his hand. If he'd have cooled off a couple of weeks ago...
Russia says the US is not bombing the group formerly known as al-Nusra in Syria, which effectively makes Russia the only force battling this group. You can't argue with that, can you?
It is true that the intelligence community in the West was, about a year ago, was looking at the Islamic State is going to win. Assad is going to collapse. Before the Russians intervened, it looked like the Islamic State would march into Damascus. So some hard thinking went on in the Western intelligence community to say, well, if Assad's troops are falling apart, his army's falling apart, who can we put in Damascus instead of the Islamic State? Now, al-Nusra, as it was called recently, is al-Qaeda revamped. And it is not as radical as the Islamic State. There's quite a lot of differences. So there was some hard thinking saying better the enemy we sort of know, the devil we know, rather than the Islamic State. So there was an element of that. But since then... Sorry?
You talked just now about the media spin over on your side where you are there now. Here's what Russia's foreign minister had to say about accusations recently put on Russia, you've heard them as well, over civilian casualties in Syria. Let's get his words and I'll come straight back to you.
We take all necessary precautions not to hit civilians. If this happens, well, we are very sorry, but we need to investigate each and every accusation.
So Russia says anytime this happens, they haven't denied that there have been civilian casualties in this war zone ongoing, but every time they say each one's going to be investigated, which is more than happened when you look at the American attacks. Think the deadly attack in Manbij, also Deir ez-Zor. We've heard very little of the outcome of that.
There was an apology by the Americans. Look, there are incidents on all sides in wars. But as I said, until a couple of weeks ago, President Putin could have stood back and said, we've achieved a lot. We've restored relations with America. President Putin was standing tall in the Middle East. And now, not just in the West, but in the Middle East, Russia is seen to be a partisan force which is attacking Arabs, attacking Muslims, and so on. And it has restored, President Putin has restored his relationship somewhat with Israel, with Turkey.
You're saying attacking Muslims. Sir, there's a difference to be drawn between attacking Muslims and attacking terrorists, which is what Russia's doing.
well, in every war and at all time, the opponents are called terrorists. What Russia and Assad call terrorists, in most countries, including in the Middle East, these fighters are considered to be freedom fighters of the Free Syrian Army and other forces. But what I'd like to say, I just wish, because Russia is about to step into a very dangerous zone with this, because of the perception of what it's doing in the Baltic states.
I go back to al-Nusra. Why? It's a terrorist group. Why has America not got it firmly in the crosshairs here? We even heard allegations today from the Russian side that there was a longer game plan here, that maybe the Americans were trying to install them if they managed to overthrow Assad. And that's why they're not in the crosshairs.
I just conceded that. There were some. You always think of alternatives, and some Western thinkers. I mean, it was highly secretive, and nobody's going to confess to it. Very few people knew anything about it. But if Assad had fallen, which he probably would have if the Russians hadn't gone in, then it looked like the Islamic State, which was on the outskirts of Damascus, would take over. And so there was hostility in America and Britain.
Why has it taken so long for America to separate, as Russia's been saying all along, these so-called, if you want to call them, moderate terrorists from the more difficult terrorists? Time and time again, they haven't separated the group formerly known as the al-Nusra Front from the so-called moderate rebels. Why is this? Didn't happen before America went in. We keep having, before Russia went in. Very little happened before Russia went in. And not much has happened on the American side to do this since. There's been excuse after excuse from the State Department. In fact, let's listen to the guys. Come straight back to you.
To be blunt about it, Justin, we've said that we're not interested in doing that as long as Russia is not willing to make a constructive contribution to our counter-ISIL effort.
We have not agreed to cooperate with Russia so long as they continue to pursue a mistaken strategy.
All right, well, there's a slightly different clip, but I thought we were also going to be playing a clip that we've seen time and time again of various people in the State Department saying what a difficult task it was to separate the so-called moderate rebels from the more hardline rebels. And every time we heard they're going on about it. But let's talk about cooperation. For months, Russia's been offering the US to start exchanging intelligence data so no mistakes would be made in Syria, as we had seen recently with those Syrian troops. The US has refused to do it. If they're equal parties at the table here, trying to clamp down on terrorism and do the best thing for Syria, why wouldn't they do that?
Well, it seems to me, just as in Russia, there seems to be a split between your foreign ministry and your defense ministry. There's been similar splits in the West. And there are some of those who are opposed to working with the Russians. I said the only way there can be peace in the Middle East is to start with Syria. The Russians and the Americans have to work together. And it's just so unfortunate the Americans attacked those and killed those 60 Syrian troops. And that was wrong, and they apologized. And the Russians seemed determined to help Assad take Aleppo. But once Aleppo was taken...
It wasn't just there, though. I mean, I go back to these attacks to what happened in Manjib and Deir ez-Zor as well. Very little was heard about that. That was a mistake as well. But what was the comeback of that as far as the Americans are concerned? What was the penalty? What price did they have to pay for that?
What penalty have the Russians paid for anything in Syria? Look, it was a mistake, and they said they twice contacted the Russians, who could have forewarned them. Look, there's been a breakdown in communication, and the only way it could have worked was Russia and America working together, and therefore it might have restored relations then in Ukraine and the Baltics and so forth. But this last few weeks, the Russian military determination to try and finish the job so that then Assad can not only stay in power but maintain the central base, which is his pro-Alawite base. That's what Russia's trying to do. But as I said, it's overstepped the mark. It has destroyed, probably permanently, the relationship with America. There can be no proper ceasefire now. The war goes on. Russia's going to be more and more entangled in the quagmire. It could have been so different. And I think, that's right, President Putin should actually try and moderate his position. He's done well. He achieved all that he wanted in terms of his aims. Now he's gone over the hill. So it's on the losing side.
Thanks for giving a short view. Thanks for coming on the programme. Paul Moorcroft, Director of the Centre for Foreign Policy Analysis, and giving us your take on what's been happening there. A big mess, no matter how you look at it. Thank you, sir. And thank you for being with us too. Next, in our programme called Radicalise, we invite you to meet the millennials among America's political resistance, from the roots in the Occupy movement to a force these days in their own right.